a little bit of that at the beginning, and then because it leads into the regression that happens later on. So,
So just, I got about from the edge of the table to there.
Yeah,
Is
great.
that, yeah, that's with the
That's great.
camera angle.
yep. So, all right. So should we wait for this last person or just get going?
You can slowly start,
Yeah,
intro.
let's get started. So. Make sure this is working. So on October 30th of 1996, there was a big fire at a ranger station in Oregon. It's called the Oak Ridge Ranger Station. It was part of the U.S. Forest Service. The U.S. Forest Service exists underneath the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And so the Forest Service, while many people think its job is to protect the forests that are national forest public lands, from a different point of view, its job is to actually help harvest the forest, cut them down, sell them to private companies. They lease the land to private companies who then come in and clear cut, and then they try to, hopefully the trees will regrow and they'll do it again in another 200 years. But so a lot of people feel like the Forest Service is protected, but it's not necessarily. The national forests are not necessarily protected. And during 1995, I believe. Yeah, the U.S. Congress passed something called the Salvage Rider, which opened up a whole lot of national forests to be clear-cut. And it was actually 330 large sections of national forests were open to private corporations to be clear-cut, and they had a small window to do this in. So there was a surge in the latter half of the 90s to cut down as many of these pieces of national forest land as possible. Timber companies are going in, and they were cutting down a lot of forest really quickly. And environmentalists had felt like this was protected land, this was public land, so we were working to protect these forests. And this was happening very quickly, so you didn't have a whole lot of time to launch a campaign. You definitely didn't have time for legal efforts and for things like letter writing campaigns and stuff like that. While people did launch legal efforts and letter writing campaigns, they needed to buy time in order to make those things give them a chance. So in the meantime, they were buying time by doing a lot of forest blockades. A lot of tree sits became really popular during that time. People climb a tree and they'd set up like a camp way up in the tree. And therefore, if you cut that tree down or one of the ones near it, it would endanger the lives of the people that were living up in the tree or sitting up in there. So it would protect this area. And they would also do a lot of road blockades because they would need these logging roads to go into the forest to bring in the equipment to cut down the trees and haul the trees out. And if you blocked the logging road, then they couldn't get the equipment in, and the forest would be protected, at least potentially for enough time to build like a public campaign so that people were more upset about the forest being cut down, or to let a legal effort go through, or otherwise try to protect it using a variety of means, not just by stopping the logging right then and there, but by buying time so that every sort of way that you work protecting the forest has a chance to actually play out. What had happened was all these people, a whole generation of people came in and quickly became sort of radical forest activists. They would go out to these campaigns, mostly in the Pacific Northwest where the old growth forests are, and they would block these trees, and they'd live out in the wilderness for a long time, out in nature through winter, over a year, sometimes 2 years, and really get connected and feel close with these forests. And most of the time, the campaigns ultimately failed. So most of the time, people go out there and they spend a lot of time getting very intimate and connected with nature, with the forest, and then they see that exact site just get annihilated, just get wiped out, totally clear cut. And it was devastating. And in the meantime, these federal agents that worked for the U.S. Forest Service, who were supposed to be in some way protecting the forest, were actually the ones making the arrests and taking down the blockades and the tree sits. So it was very frustrating. And the Forest Service, like I said, was facilitating all these clear cuts. They were the ones that were saying, okay, it's going to be this piece of land and we're going to sell it to this company. And so the Forest Service became a very big target. There were these protest signs with Smokey the Bear with like a chainsaw sticking out from behind his back, and all these other sort of like cute, you know, say it ain't so Smokey type of protests that were going on. The Forest Service was a big target. And people felt like already 98% of the old growth had been cut down by the mid-90s. So what was left in the U.S. was just 2% of our old growth forest, and that was being cut very rapidly during this time period. And so people felt like needed to do something more, needed to step it up a notch. And so they set a fire at the Oak Ridge Ranger Station, which is a big fancy ranger station in rural Oregon that actually sort of facilitates a number of the cuts that were going on in that region. And it cost $5 million in damages. And they released a communique claiming it more or less as an action of a group called the Earth Liberation Front. And this is the first time that the Earth Liberation Front had taken an action in the U.S. And it read in part, the communique read, "Welcome to the struggle of all species to be free. We are the burning rage of this dying planet. The war of greed ravages the earth and species die out every day. The Earth Liberation Front works to speed up the collapse of industry, to scare the rich, and to undermine the foundations of the state. We embrace social and deep ecology as a practical resistance movement. We have to show the enemy that we are serious about defending what is sacred." This is Oak Ridge from the sky. That is like a box truck, like the size of a UPS truck, so you get a sense of the footprint of the building, and you also get a sense of just how destroyed it was by that fire. This is a Canadian lynx. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service lists it as threatened, although many people would argue that it should be listed as endangered in the U.S. There's very few habitat left for this. It sort of lives in mature forest along the northern border of the U.S. in a few places, and people have been using the spotted owl often, citing it in legal cases to protect forests, and really wanted to get the lynx listed as endangered, Canadian lynx, as endangered because if you could find a lynx in an area, then it would protect the forest the same way they were finding spotted owls in areas that protect the forest. And for that exact same reason, from the other side of the spectrum, people that do not want this animal listed as endangered, even though it technically should be and it falls under the same sort of situation as the spotted owl, there was a lot of lobbying and petitioning to make sure it didn't get listed as endangered because people wanted to cut the forest down. So, this is Vail Ski Resort, October 18th, 1998. Cost $24.5 million in damage, this fire. This is one of actually 7 structures that were set on fire that night by the Earth Liberation Front, and this is, I'm going to read some of the communique. On behalf of the Lynx, 5 buildings and 4 ski lifts at Vail were reduced to ashes on the night of Sunday, October 18th. Vail is already the largest ski resort in North America and now wants to expand even further. 12 miles of roads and 885 acres of clear cuts will ruin the last best lynx habitat in the state. Putting profits ahead of Colorado's wildlife will not be tolerated. This action is just a warning. We'll be back if this greedy corporation continues to trespass into wild and unroaded areas. For your safety and convenience, we strongly advise skiers to choose other destinations until Vail cancels its inexcusable plans for expansion, Earth Liberation Front. This is Christmas Eve, 1999, Boise Cascade Corporation. Boise Cascade was, and although it's changed its name, continues to be one of the largest and most recognizable forest product companies in the world, but especially here in North America. They take the forest and they turn them into products. They actually call themselves forest product companies. So I'll just read the communique. I think it explains it better than I can do. Boise Cascade has been very naughty. After ravaging the forests of the Pacific Northwest, Boise Cascade now looks towards the virgin forests of Chile. Early Christmas morning, elves left coal in Boise Cascade's stocking. 4 buckets of diesel and gas with kitchen timer delays destroyed their regional headquarters in Monmouth, Oregon. Let this be a lesson to all greedy multinational corporations who do not respect their ecosystems. The elves are watching. Earth Liberation Front. There's $1 million in damages. New Year's Eve, 1999, $1 million in damages here to a research facility housed by Michigan State University, funded by Monsanto and USAID. It's a genetic engineering research that was going on there. And again, the communique explains it better than I can. The ELF takes credit for a strike on the strike on the offices of Catherine Ives at Michigan State University, December 31st, 1999. The offices were doused with gasoline and set afire. This was in response to the work being done to force developing nations in Asia, Latin America, and Africa to switch from natural crop plants to genetically engineered sweet potatoes, corn, bananas, and pineapples. Monsanto and USAID are major funders of the research and promotional work being done through Michigan State University. Cremate Monsanto along with the ELF. This was the first time that any really large-scale sabotage was used against genetic engineering in the U.S. And it got a lot of media, like the Vail action earlier, it got a lot of media attention. There was a Frontline PBS documentary made about genetic engineering only because of this action. It then decided it was a big, PBS then decided it was a big deal and made a whole documentary on it. As the office afterwards, the researcher's not going to get a whole lot of work done there. January 1st of 2001, Earth Liberation Front set fire to offices of Superior Lumber in Glendale, Oregon. Superior is a logging company, but Superior was involved in a whole lot of extremely controversial clear cuts, areas that had been protected for a long time that were roadless, that didn't have roads. These are like, you're not familiar with Zor Valley, but there's areas with big valleys that have old growth forest growing in them, and they can't get roads down into these valleys and ravines, and therefore, because of that natural barrier, these areas have been protected, and all the areas around them have been cut, but it's like the last vestige of nature out there, and so either that or other just huge swaths of wilderness that just didn't get roaded yet, don't have roads in them yet, have been protected, and so the first thing they do when they want to cut a forest, they put a road into it, if they can, and then they get their equipment and they cut it down. Superior specialized in something that enabled them to take the trees out without roads. And if you look inside, this is the office of Superior Lumber here. And if you look underneath the head of the stuffed swordfish, you'll see a large frame photograph of a logging helicopter. This company went into areas that were protected because it didn't have roads with helicopters. And so they would cut the trees down and lift them out from the helicopter and just pull them right out. So it didn't matter if you blockaded a road, or if there wasn't a road, or if there was a ravine. They used military-grade, very strong helicopters to pull these trees out without roads. And so you couldn't do the logging blockade. Even if you were going to do a blockade up in trees, it would only protect that area right next to the trees and not the rest of the forest. You couldn't block the road going in, you couldn't stop it. So environmentalists were upset with Superior, naturally, and this is the inside of the building afterwards, and they released this communique. We torched Superior Lumber in Glendale, Oregon on January 1st, 2001. Superior Lumber is a typical earth raper, contributing to the ecological destruction of the Northwest. What happened to them should shock no one. This year, 2001, we hope to see an escalation in tactics against capitalism and industry. Well, Superior Lumber says, make a few products and do it better than anyone else. We say, choose an earth raper and destroy them. Earth Liberation Front. Here is a commercial SUV lot in Eugene, Oregon. What that means is that this is a car sales company that sells to other companies, not to individuals. So there's actually a tax credit out there. You'll notice like tattoo shops with like Hummers, Humvees, and they have like logo on the side of them. That's because they get a huge tax write-off if they have a heavy-duty truck for their company, regardless of whether there's any use for that truck. So they get these huge tax write-offs. So that's why you see these like little companies that don't haul anything anywhere ever with these like silly, ridiculous like Hummers with logos on them around. So that's kind of what they did here. They sold these trucks to these companies that were basically just advertising. And back then, if you'll remember, it was called global warming, the concern. And it was largely considered a hoax that, we put too much pollution out in the environment, that it was changing, it was warming the planet up, and the ice caps were melting, etc. Things have changed. The vice president put out a documentary, blah, blah, blah. Now it's called climate change. And now it's largely believed, but at the time it was largely ignored and considered a hoax, and most of our elected officials were agreeing that it was a hoax, regardless of what the science said. So people felt like this issue wasn't being paid attention to. And plus, if you remember, in the 80s and even the early 90s, cars were small and efficient. Like there was this gas problem in the 70s where you could only get gas every like day of the week that corresponded with your license plate number. You couldn't just go and buy gas every day because there was a gas shortage. So this whole thing happened in the 80s where cars became really small. They made these little hatchbacks. They got like 30, 40 miles per gallon. It wasn't a hybrid, which is a little compact car. But then the 90s, mid-90s came around, and that whole thing changed, right? And people started, they did, you know, this SUV thing happened, and so all these, you saw these like single people driving to and from work every day in this giant SUV that was getting 10 miles or less per gallon. It's causing a lot of pollution, so people were upset. So they thought, well, maybe we can do something that'll make people pay attention to this issue, draw some attention to it, and it definitely drew some attention to it. So there was $1 million worth of SUVs torched the entire lot, 36 of them in Eugene, and communique said $1 million worth of luxury SUVs were torched at Romania Chevrolet. Sucking the land dry, gas-guzzling SUVs are at the forefront of this vile imperialistic culture's caravan towards self-destruction. We can no longer allow the rich to parade around in their armored existence, leaving a wasteland behind in their tire tracks. The time is right to fight back. Romania Chevrolet is the same location that was targeted last June, for which 2 Earth warriors are being persecuted. The techno-industrial state thinks it can stop the growing resistance by jailing some of us, but they cannot jail the spirit of those who know another world is possible. The fire that burns within them burns within all of us and cannot be extinguished by locking them up. In this continuous assault on both the planet and ourselves, SUVs destroy the Earth while the prison system tries to destroy those who see beyond this empty life. We must strike out against what destroys us before we are all either choking on smog or held captive by the state. Take power into your own hands. It's your life. As you can see, the news media are pretty interested in this. And what happened here, to kind of explain that communique a little bit, there were 2 people about a year prior who went to that exact same dealership and set a fire. They were known as Free and Critter at the time. Now, Jeff Lewers was known as Free back then, but and Craig Marshall was known as Critter. So Craig got 5 years in prison for burning 2 trucks, causing about $20,000 in damage. And Jeff decided he would take it to trial. Jeff got 22 years and in prison for burning trucks. Nobody was hurt, and it cost about $19,000 in damage. It's outrageous, but what was really happening was that, you know, all these fires were happening, all this like exciting militant sort of radical action was happening around the environment, and they finally caught somebody. The reason they caught these people is because they had profiled them as anarchists, and they'd been following them around all that weekend. There was a conference that weekend, an activist conference in Eugene. They followed a number of people around. Jeff and Craig were 2 of the people they were following around. Just so happened that they were going to go do this that night, and they were being followed, so they got caught. So the state threw the book at them and gave them 22 years. Gave Jeff 22 years, and it was scary. You know, people in the movement who were supportive of radical action were, you know, maybe thinking twice, and so the ELF said, well, we can't have that. We'll go back to that exact same lot, and we'll burn the whole thing down, right? And so that's what they did, and they got away with that. And so what happened then was a whole spree of, you know, of actions against SUV dealerships across the country, even beyond that, for a number of years. You probably heard, you know, people were burning SUVs or destroying them here and there around the place. A number of them were claimed by the ELF, but a number were unclaimed or claimed by other groups. So it was sort of a phenomenon happened after this action. It started this whole like let's fuck up SUVs movement. So I just show those 6 actions to give you a sense of what the ELF was doing at the time period. There's, between 1996 and 2002, there were 36 similar actions claimed by the Earth Liberation Front. There were dozens that were either claimed by other groups or sort of unclaimed that were clearly along the same lines. And just the ones that are claimed by the Earth Liberation Front during their peak were causing about $2.5 million in damages and happening every 3 to 4 months. So it was quite something. You know, it was considered the most costly spree of economic sabotage in U.S. history, and it was garnering an awful lot of media attention. At the time period, I was running a group called the ELF Press Office. I wasn't underground, I wasn't lighting these fires myself, but we did have like a PO box and a phone number and an email address. and a PGPP and stuff like that. And we would receive communiques, like the ones I read, including the ones I read, light a fire and then go out and talk to the press about it without getting arrested. That's what we did. That's what I was doing. And we're also producing our own, material because, when Fox News or CNN or whoever, I don't even know all these different cameras, when they represent these things, it's not exactly in a favorable light, right? They, in many cases, are actually being funded through advertising dollars by the same companies that the ELF is burning down. So, we would get a lot of news stories, but they wouldn't be favorable. So then we would also produce our own stuff, videos, newspapers, leaflets, and we would do events like this at schools and talk to people or otherwise at communities. And the media was very, very interested in this type of stuff. You're speaking their language. All of a sudden, when they would pay no attention to global warming, now they're finding this stuff very interesting because it just caused last night it caused $1 million in damage to some big fancy company, destroyed some big building. So at first they would do this like ridiculous little silly stuff with clip art of firefighter hats. They would do clip art of firefighters, like here, this guy's famous. This kind of silliness too, I don't know if that's like a matches or some kind of fire. This is a good one, floating anarchy symbol over like a trash can. They would kind of come up with their own stuff, cute little phrases. And this is this is interesting, it's a photograph of somebody who was at a protest. I'm sure you're familiar with people going to protests and wearing masks because, hey, they're getting their pictures taken. So this is just, that person actually was at a grand jury protest in Portland, but that didn't really matter to KATU2 News. It looked like it could be an Earth Liberation Front member all masked up and ready to burn something down, so they just put it up there as if it were an Earth Liberation Front member. This is good, eco-terror rally. Gotta love those. They really liked the sort of imagery that the ELF would create. Anything from graffiti like this, was always on the news. They would show these things over and over again. If they could get newscasters standing next to it, that was a good thing. They would get out helicopters and film, destruction and, vandalism from the sky. They really liked things that were destroyed and things that were on fire, buildings on fire, vehicles on fire. Really big buildings on fire were really good. And they really did a lot of interviews. They couldn't get over the sort of like Robin Hood mystique of the ELF. Not that they ever agreed with it, but they would show time and time again. They would have interview after interview after interview out on the streets, in their studios, in our community spaces, at protests, Fox Live debates all across the country. In big studios, this is National Geographic TV, they would rent hotels and do interviews in there. This is actually recently now, I'm not spokesperson anymore, but now they put former on there and they still call me up for interviews all the time. This is a video that we produced with the press office back then. Like I said, they weren't always showing these things in a favorable light, so so we would produce our own stuff. We produced this 20-minute video. It's online still. It's translated into all these languages. It's very low budget. It's somewhat embarrassing, but its point was to say you know what, you're not getting the true story from the news. So listen to what we have to say about it. The environment needs to be protected. All these legal means aren't working on their own. We're being forced to take more radical action or just watch the planet die. So if you want to form your own ELF cell, this is how to do it. That's essentially the video in a nutshell. This part here, I'm actually walking through the forest and talking about why it's so important to protect nature. And if you cut down all the trees, you won't be able to breathe anymore. If you pollute all the rivers, you won't be able to drink any water anymore. Stuff like that. But Fox, in this case, decided to put an image from that up there with the implication that it was an ELF training video. That that I'm running through the woods, teaching people guerrilla warrior tactics or something like that. There were other weird ironies, on a slow news night they would put up sort of damage estimate tallies from ELF terrorism in Oregon as if it were a sports team that we were following. They would reprint ELF communiques on here. This one on the lower right is from the Romania Chevrolet dealership I read a moment ago. They would actually reprint the ELF guidelines online. And if you're familiar, the point of the guidelines is to show people how to form their own cell. This is a decentralized group. There's no central leadership. You can form your own ELF cell and start taking actions as long as you follow these 3 guidelines. A couple of them are up on the screen here. Of course, the news didn't quite get that. To them, it was just sensational, good news. So, not really understand what they were doing, I'm assuming. They're putting up how to form your ELF cell for tens of thousands of people across the state of Oregon to learn how to do that night. This was my favorite piece of, weird little piece of irony. This was the first time of 3 that this news program called 60 Minutes did a story on the Earth Liberation Front. Is everyone familiar with 60 Minutes? Especially back in the 90s and earlier, it was like a huge, major way to get your news in this country before the internet was really a news source. Millions of people watch 60 Minutes every night. So what they did after the Boise Cascade Fire, which I briefly talked about earlier, is they recreated the scenario with the fire department. They actually got a firefighter to recreate an ELF-style incendiary device. Then he went ahead and told you where the ELF might want to place the device along the building. Then he went ahead and lit the device, and then as it was burning, he told you how hot and how high the flames went. I couldn't share those details with you without going to prison, but 60 Minutes can do it, and did, which is interesting. Also, there was a film, If a Tree Falls, some of you have seen it, that chronicles some of what the Earth Liberation Front was doing. It really focuses on the arrest of this one group that was very active, so it covers a lot of the history, although not all of it, which I helped produce and I was featured in. But this is where Mike Kuzma comes in to start helping out here. So I'm going to have a seat, but I do just want to say that it wasn't just all fun and games, and it wasn't just the media who were paying attention to what was going on with the ELF.
Yes, good morning. I'm Mike Kuzma. I'm a lawyer based in Buffalo. I'm Leslie's friend, and I, along with Dare Irwin, have been representing Leslie in some of the cases he has pending under the Federal Freedom of Information Act. But I just wanted to bring to your attention the ELF, or Earth Liberation Front press office that Leslie and Craig worked in. Their activity was fully protected by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which, among other things, guarantees Americans the right to freedom of speech and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Now, as a result of Leslie's activity, in addition, Craig Roseborough was involved with the press office, but as a result of Leslie's involvement with the press office and Craig's, they were targeted by a host of federal agencies such as the FBI, the ATF, the Oregon State Police, and others, U.S. Marshal Service. Agents would come, and this is pretty common, especially if you've studied the history of the FBI throughout its existence. They'll visit a targeted individual at his or her place of work, home. They'll talk to relatives and that. And it's all designed to intimidate the target of the FBI or ATF. Okay, what they would do is, if they would approach, say, an employer or a family member, even talk to Leslie himself, these agents would actually reveal information that was, quite intimate, details that only Leslie or a family member would possess. The FBI threatened Leslie with incarceration, that he would spend many years in prison. There were 7 federal grand jury subpoenas that were served on the press office. There was also a congressional subcommittee subpoena served on the press office. There was a raid by the FBI in January of 2000, and then there was a multi-agency raid in 2001. Here's an actual search warrant. It was, served by the FBI. You can see there's Leslie's got the pointer, it's got his name, his address. It was authorized by a judge on April 4th, 2001. It was good for 10 days. The raid happened almost immediately, and they always get you at an inopportune time. In this case, it happened on April 5th, 2001 at 6 a.m. They bank on the element of surprise. Here's an article, there's Leslie, Craig, and that's what we're in, right? And this article appeared in the Oregon paper the day after the raid, so that was on April 6th. Now, here's actually one of the FBI agents, and today's the, 20th anniversary of the bombing in Oklahoma City. If you see some of the footage, you see the agents there all have sunglasses. I guess they all get, a pair of sunglasses upon their graduation from the academy. But the reason the agent here is wearing gloves, they don't want to disturb any fingerprints that may be on the, what is that, the printer, correct?
Yeah.
And if you've ever been to Portland, it's not a very sunny place, so there's really no need for those sunglasses. It's designed to conceal the agent's identity, and there were journalists from indie media taking these photographs. So here's a bunch of the evidence the Fed seized. You have a fax machine, and we all know all the storage capacity of a fax machine, a scanner, and then again, this is over a decade and a half ago. So you have a scanner, once again, no storage capacity, but yet they were seizing it for evidence, at least that's what they allege. There's a computer keyboard, once again, no storage capacity, and that was also seized because the feds claim they were looking for evidence. Now, the real reason they took this stuff was to incapacitate the ELF office, because without the fax machine, the keyboards and that, they couldn't continue doing the work that they were involved in. Here's the agents actually exiting Leslie's home. Here's a document we obtained under the Oregon's Public Records Law, which is comparable to the Federal Freedom of Information Act, which I'll be talking about at 11:15, but I'll let Leslie jump in.
Yeah, we threw this document in a little earlier. There'll be much more documents later, but just to give you a sense of the kind of harassment and intimidation that was going on a day-to-day basis. The first paragraph describes two agents, one a state agent and one a federal agent, going to visit one house. And then the second paragraph talks about those same two agents then going about 6 blocks a few minutes later to go visit the second house. The second house is my house. And what was happening, this is 2000. So they've been serving grand jury subpoenas since 1997. So they're not just coming to say, hi, do you want to have a conversation? They're actually coming to serve grand jury subpoenas, although they don't say that explicitly in here. Also, before I read any of this, you'll notice it says PM, and down here it's AM. They're both AM. There's a lot of typos in these kinds of things. You picture a cop like arresting somebody, and then at the end of the day, they have to fill out a report. That's essentially what's going on here. People weren't hired for their literary skills and accuracy, so they screw up quite a bit. So, at 8:25 a.m. on March 1st, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms with ATF agent Comrie and myself, and the person who's writing this is an Oregon State Police agent, went to an address in Portland. We were contacted at the door by a female who did not identify herself. We asked the female if we could speak with subject number 1. She asked who we were. We told her that Special Agent Comrie with ATF, I was with the Oregon State Police. She asked us if we had a warrant. We responded by saying that we did not, at which point she slammed the door shut. Skip to the next paragraph down, the next house. Again, this is about 6 blocks away, and this is 8:42 a.m. after the 10, 15 minutes, whatever that it took there, and it took them a few more minutes to get to this next house. As we approached Agent Comrie and myself attempted to contact subject number 2 at this address in Oregon at this time. I'm subject number 2. If you look around an earlier page, it lists me as subject number 2. As we approached the residence, we observed a male and female leaving the area from behind the residence on bicycles. We made contact with an unknown female who told us she would wake subject number 2. The unknown female closed the door and never returned. The female who left on the bicycle returned and asked us who we were. She was also living at this mysterious address, which is right here. Special Agent Comrie asked the female if she was subject number 3. She confirmed that she was. She informed us that she was with subject Pickering. Now they're getting lazy.
I'm not served number 2 anymore, I'm now serving Pickering. But then Mr. Pickering was late for a meeting and did not want to talk with us. I'm sure you're familiar, there's not a whole lot of activist meetings at 8:30, 8:45 in the morning. What was really happening here is these agents tried to serve a grand jury subpoena at this house. This house somehow got word to my house, just in time for me and another person to leave the building before they were able to serve the warrants, and therefore that day they were unable and unsuccessful to serve search warrants. This type of stuff happened all the time. And we just happened to get this document detailing this one day, which I had totally forgotten about. I don't even remember this, whatever, because it was so frequent. But it gives you an idea of what we dealt with on a day-to-day basis for years.
Now, in September of 2011, Leslie, his wife Teresa, who's out in the hall at the book table, Nate Buckley, a local activist in Buffalo, they opened up a bookstore called Burning Books at 420 Connecticut Street. And the activities of Burning Books, in addition to selling magazines and various books and tapes and DVDs, they bring in speakers like Ward Churchill, Ramona Africa, Rachel Wilkenstein, and so on. The activity of the bookstore is fully protected by not only the U.S. Constitution, First Amendment, but Article 1, Sections 8 and 9 of the New York State Constitution. Those are our parallel rights at the state level. In fact, the state courts give you more rights under the state constitution than the federal constitution. Now, these are the gentleman to my far left is the current director. The FBI is the new J. Edgar Hoover. And then the guy closest to me is Brian Botig. He's the special agent in charge, or SAC for short. Now, the reason we're focusing in on the FBI is that in the August of 2012, an agent from the Buffalo field office called an old friend of Leslie who was living across the country. And this agent asked a number of questions. They wanted to know, was Leslie capable of committing direct action? Was he able to influence or manipulate people? Was he a loner or an extremist? And then this agent mentioned an unsolved ELF action from 2002, which allegedly caused $1 million in damages to a U.S. Forest Service research station in Pennsylvania, where they were apparently doing generic manipulation of trees. Now, the agent claimed that that Leslie was stirring up the youth. That's why they had to make this phone call. And probably the most disconcerting question by this FBI agent was they wanted to know who they could talk to who did not like Leslie. Why would they do that? They're looking for someone who's going to make things up if need be, perhaps even, attack their reputation, what have you. And this is a page right out of the FBI's COINTELPRO tactics. So now this document here, you can see it's captioned Mail Watch. Now this was found in Leslie's mailbox in September of 2012. So it's marked confidential, and this was actually placed in Leslie's mailbox by accident by the mail carrier. So it says this was never meant to be delivered to Leslie. Now it says show, you can see Leslie's highlighting it, show all mail to supervisor for copying prior to going out on the street, confidential. Now this memo, if you even want to call it that, indicates that Leslie was the subject of a mail cover. It's a little-known investigative tool that's been used by the Postal Service, usually at the behest of another federal or state law enforcement agency. And this is where they actually copy all your incoming mail. Years ago, before copying machines, the post office actually had forms where they would jot down the name, the return address, the addressee, and the date of the postmark, and where the postmark was from. This is Bill Hochul. He's our U.S. Attorney for the Western District of New York. His wife is the Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul. But in February of 2013, so you see the sequence. First you had the person contacted in the fall, then you had the mail watch. So then we learned that it was served on a local financial institution, and the feds wanted records regarding Leslie, the bookstore, and his family. And they wanted all records for burning books, so they wanted, a little over 2 years of bank records for the bookstore. Now, Bill Hochul's in charge of grand juries. Now, just to give you a little history on how federal grand jury subpoenas work, they're in pad form. There's no judicial oversight, so any U.S. attorney can just hand them out. Now, in theory, they're supposed to be personally served on the recipient. We know for a fact in this case, the institution wasn't served personally, but they complied with the subpoena nonetheless. Okay, now, so we have the grand jury subpoena. The following month, March of 2013, Leslie's flying to the West Coast, and you can see there's this marking on his ticket. Does anyone know what that stands for? Well, Leslie had been placed without his knowledge or consent. Of course, the government does this anyway, but that's called secondary security screening selection. So they have a list. So if you ever get a plane, if you're ever flying, check to see if you have this designation on your plane ticket. Now the selectee list, as it's better known, is maintained by the Transportation Security Administration, and all people placed on the selectee list get extra scrutiny. You'll get additional security screening. You may be subjected to a chemical swab test, which Leslie was put on your way back from the West Coast. Full body scans, pat-downs, luggage searches. Now the TSA will claim these are just random. There's no criteria for putting people on the list, but that simply isn't the case. If the TSA or another federal agency says we want Leslie Pickering on the list, guess what? You're placed on that list. Okay, we'll go back to that in a bit. We'll actually show a document we got on your FOIA. Okay, here. So after we discovered the FBI phone call, the grand jury subpoena, the mail cover, the selectee designation, we decided we had to do something. We couldn't just sit there and be punching bags. So we just, a bunch of us got together, another attorney, Leslie, editor of a local alternative weekly. We decided to come up with a plan of attack, if you will, to strike back. So we decided to use the media and some legal remedies to expose what was happening to Leslie, the bookstore, and his family. Now, this is the first article that actually went out. It appeared in Our Voice. It was titled "The USA versus Leslie Pickering." And it pretty much broke the story of what was happening to Leslie and his family, and it also and burning books, and it launched our campaign to expose the criminality of the FBI and some of these other agencies. Okay, here's an article that actually we had a hell of a time getting this article in, but it appeared on May Day of what was it, 2013. Now, Mark Summer actually had to rewrite this article several times because one of the editors at the Buffalo News is pretty right-wing and actually supports what the FBI is doing. But after a lot of effort, this article appeared. The New York Times, it was actually July 4th. They did a story, mainly Ron Nixon, the reporter in this instance, did a story, was looking into mail covers. As a result of this article, we learned that now all mail in the United States is scanned. So they have a database of all mail that's deposited in the United States. So in many ways, mail covers are obsolete. Okay, the Times does the piece, so then paper in California, Santa Rosa to be exact, picked up on the Ron Nixon New York Times piece. So here's a letter, part of our strategy, our legal strategy and PR campaign was to write our elected representatives in both the US House and Senate. We wrote Chuck Schumer, we wrote Gillibrand, we wrote Senator Leahy, he's the chairman, he's from Vermont, he's the chairman of the Senate committee that we thought would have oversight. We wrote Charles Grassley from Iowa, we wrote Richard Durbin from Illinois, he's the so-called big progressive. He's the chairman of the subcommittee on Constitution, Civil Rights, and Human Rights. We haven't heard from Senator Durbin. We wrote Tom Carper, the chairman of the U.S. Subcommittee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. They have oversight regarding the post office. Haven't heard from that guy. Haven't heard from Kirsten Gillibrand, or Gigglebrand, as my one friend calls her. Haven't heard from her. Rand Paul, if you recall, at this time, in 2014, he was making quite the wave about, what was it, not TSA, you know, various revelations. He was like, the NSA spying. Well, Rand Paul, we haven't heard from him. He didn't want to be president. We wrote Blake Farenthold. He's the chairman of the Subcommittee on Federal Workforce, U.S. Postal Service, and the Census. Haven't heard from him. We complained to Mary Ann Gibbons, General Counsel and Vice President of the U.S. Postal Service. We sort of got the runaround from her. Inspector General Michael Horowitz, we complained to him about what was going on. We got blown off. DHS Traveler Redress Inquiry Program, or TRIP. You can file a complaint if you're not happy with the way TSA treats you, and they want you to feel, they have a form letter and they want you to fill out this very detailed questionnaire before they even act on your complaint. And Charles Schumer is the only one who's responded. He wrote the post office, and now the post office is ignoring Chuck Schumer. He's what, now going to be the majority leader. So it shows you these people have nothing but contempt for not only us, but even our elected representatives. Now we got these documents, because Leslie sort of strung them together, but these are copies of the envelopes that were photographed. We obtained these from the Postal Service under the Federal Freedom of Information Act. And we have different things there. We have a letter from a Tombstone engraving company regarding Leslie's grandfather's tombstone. They photocopied that. I don't know which one that is, but oh, there it is. There's a postcard from his stepfather. They copied that. That's in his Postal Service dossier and another agency's dossier. There's a student loan bill, an Amazon shipment bill, correspondence from a nursing home regarding another one of Leslie's grandparents. There's a letter from the Justice Department regarding a FOIA request that Leslie had submitted for research purposes. There's a letter that I sent to Leslie that's clearly marked legal mail. In theory, they're not supposed to copy that, but they did nonetheless. There's a water bill, and what else is there? There's another one, DOJ letter. But this is a sample of what they were copying on a daily basis. Now here's another document we got as a result of the FOIA case we brought in federal court. So all the mail was being copied and then sent on a weekly basis to this office in Chicago. Now what's most interesting is the line, and it's hard to read, but I'll read it to you. It says, compromise of this mail cover may result in disciplinary action. So if you recall that handwritten note, in theory, that carrier got pounded for inadvertently delivering that. Now this is we got this document, and just where Leslie will come in, but we also got this under FOIA from the TSA.
So to explain this, I have to explain what happened at the airport in Buffalo when we were flying out. when I got that ticket with the S's on it. When I first checked in and they issued the tickets, because we had bought them, I think, online, you have to go to the counter and they give you the ticket. I was aware of the selectee designation already thanks to the wonders of Facebook. There was another activist who I worked with who had that on his ticket and had put a picture of it up on Facebook and said, if you ever have these S's on your ticket, be ready for extra screening at the security gates. So I was looking for those S's and they weren't on there. And so my family and I, the three of us, went through the security gate without any incident and proceeded to our boarding gate on the other side of the security. And it's about that time when people are sort of crowding around the boarding gate. They're doing pre-boarding, people are getting ready to go on, and they're naming off the boarding groups. And right before they start boarding anybody, they say, first we noticed that there's a number of TSA agents milling around through the crowd, like a dozen or so. That seemed unusual, so we're kind of like looking at them, wondering what's going on. A couple came right up next to us and actually like stood up on their toes and like looked over my shoulder and my head and like to somebody off in the distance and whispered to one another, "Do you think it's that guy over there?" And so we were like, okay, something interesting is happening here. And then the airplane attendant who's working at the little podium by the aisle that you go walk down to get on the plane makes an announcement saying that everybody, there's going to be some additional random security screenings. Don't be alarmed. This is a standard operating procedure, and we're just going to have some people pulled aside randomly for additional security screenings. Thank you for your obedience. And they start boarding, and we're in like we're in like boarding group 2 or 3 or something. So a bunch of people go in before us, and nobody's pulled aside randomly. Then my wife and daughter go in before me, and they make it through just fine. But when they scan my ticket, I can see the computer screen, right around on the podium, and this giant red rectangle comes on. Selectee, selectee. It says in big white, all caps, bold letters in this big red rectangle. Selectee, selectee. Before I can even finish reading it, I get surrounded by all the TSA people, and they pull me aside, and they do this search. To dump the luggage out on the ground, search everything. They do a pat down. They do the all kinds, whatever they can do on the spot there, and they go through everything. And meanwhile, I'm not really noticing this, but you can tell in these reports that there's some people agitated that are getting boarding the plane while this is going on. I mean, we're a nice red-blooded American family, and we're just being subjected to this nonsense, and all these people are getting on, and everyone else gets on the plane. No one else is pulled aside randomly and searched, and they all get on the plane. There's some kind of incident in the background. And then at the end of it, when they fail to find all the explosives and whatever else they're looking for in our luggage, one of them actually says to me, "I'm sorry, sir, this all should have happened at the security gate," which totally blows the cover on the whole random security screening thing. I mean, this was an incident, and what you're looking at here is our incident reports. There's 2 of them. What had happened was my initial ticket did not have the designation on it, but should have. So I made it to the security gate fine, because they had just have the person sitting there looking at it. And if it's not printed on the ticket, they're like, okay, go through. But when it came to scanning it, and they figured it out somehow before I got on the plane, so they had to come and reissue me a ticket. Before I was able to get on the plane, they took that first ticket, reissued the second ticket with the designation on there. Every other ticket on that whole trip, including the return trip, all had the designation on there. So what had happened was somebody screwed up somewhere. And if they didn't, I probably wouldn't have known, because they have this whole thing about you being on there randomly, people get pulled aside for random screenings, and that's the way they cover up the fact that they're actually profiling people. So, you see this stuff here, and these are incident reports written up by different TSA agents. Again, you'll notice, as I mentioned earlier, this says gate 12, this says gate 21. They're not very good with these details, they screwed up. I believe it was gate 12, if I'm not mistaken. Basically, it just describes what had happened from their point of view. They point out a couple things that I'd like to mention. Somebody was sent out in training for remediation, and basically somebody was disciplined for screwing up, right? And they mentioned that twice on here. They also was sent to remedial training. Also, oddly, it says no media were involved. If you remember, we're past the security gate in an airport. There's no media milling around back there waiting for something exciting to happen. They're not allowed back there, right? There's no chance of media being involved, really, unless you're going to do maybe some kind of like live streaming thing on your cell phone. I don't know what. You have to plan something out. But really, there's no likelihood of any media being involved. They're still pointing out because they're so concerned that they don't want these things exposed. So.
Okay, so on this one, we actually used the state of Oregon's public records law, and we obtained this report from the Portland Police Department, or Police Bureau, as they call it. What's sort of funny about this thing is Leslie sold this car, and apparently this friend he sold the vehicle to didn't change the registration or ownership information. So the Portland police stumble upon the car with this individual sleeping in it. There was a bicycle leaning up against the automobile, and they see this guy asleep. And so they do a check on the car, and you see Leslie Pickering's name on it, and then right away, alarms go off. So they issue this report, and notice that they copied the FBI on this. And they never did actually identify the individual in the car or try to wake him up, but it's intriguing that a local police department is keeping the FBI abreast of something that they thought was still associated with Leslie Pickering. We just got to caption suspicious activity. Now, here's another document we obtained from the Portland Police Bureau. Deals with an arrest in October of 1996. This is prior to Leslie's involvement with the Earth Liberation Front press office. He was only 18 years of age. And this report was for a civil disobedience action, and Leslie was arrested for, let's see, he was at a research facility that was running experiments on cat brains. Leslie, along with 10 others, were arrested, and it says he was associated with the Animal Liberation Front. And in this instance, they've taken individuals who are exercising constitutional rights. They filed this report, sort of, they have down here what that is, a terrorist organization.
Yeah, they classify the animal
Yes.
as a terrorist organization.
So, engage in First Amendment activities, all of a sudden, you're considered to be a terrorist. Now, here's a response I got to a FOIA request I submitted on Leslie's behalf with the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. They used to be with a component of the Treasury Department. They're now a component of the Justice Department. We can thank 9/11 for that. And now the ATF, as I previously indicated, was heavily involved in the investigation into Leslie and Elf. So we send in this request. Now keep in mind the press office hasn't been in existence for what, over a decade and a half? But yet the ATF says we can't comply with your request because there's an ongoing investigation. And they're, as they put it, is still open. So we make these different FOIA requests. I'll talk about FOIA in greater length and after this presentation. But just briefly, FOIA is a federal law that was passed in '66, amended a few times, but it gives anyone a right to request records from any agency. You don't have to be a lawyer, you don't have to give a reason for making the request. So the law allows you to make requests, and there's an administrative process, but you can actually go to court if you don't get the records you are seeking access to. So what we did, here's a picture of two handsome devils on June 26th of 2013. We filed a lawsuit, and that's the U.S. District Court for the Western District of New York. And we sued the ATF and the FBI and the Postal Service for many of the records that were being withheld. So we got additional documents, but some of the court filings are also very helpful. And this was an affirmation from the FBI, a guy by the name of David M. Hardy. He's the head of the FOIA section of the FBI. And what Mr. Hardy did was confirm that what we had suspected, that was the FBI behind that mail cover. Now, this quote here from Mr. Hardy is quite interesting. He states that the FBI sought the assistance of the Postal Inspection Service in furtherance of a domestic terrorism investigation. So this information was quite helpful, which we wouldn't have gotten without the FOIA lawsuit. Now here's we filed a subsequent FOIA lawsuit against ATF, and we got 187 pages of material. This case is still pending in the federal court.
You'll notice here that when we first contacted the ATF with our request, they said they weren't going to give us anything. But as soon as we filed a lawsuit, they dropped that claim and released 186.
That seemed they did it right in time for Christmas, December 23rd. Now here's one of the documents that we obtained as a result of that FOIA lawsuit.
This one's fun. It's this is from the ATF. It's kind of funny. Again, I like to point this one out because it can be kind of scary seeing all the stuff that the government does to people, and they have a lot of power and they do a lot of awful things. But at the same time, they also screw up a lot, and they're really not all that smart sometimes. And it's good to sort of keep in mind that there's a balance between that. You know, that we do actually have an upper hand in some circumstances, often in the field of intelligence. So what's happening here is that they're raiding our home for the second time. This is in April of 2001, and there's an agent in the first paragraph who is watching my two roommates while I'm in another room being read the search warrant. And we also have a fourth roommate, Craig Roseborough, who really ran the press office with me, who's out making deliveries for a company that he was for work at the moment. So he's out being raided in his car. So it says at 6:30 a.m. Special Agent so-and-so was in the kitchen area of the residence reading the warrant to Pickering. I was present in the living room of the residence with, these are the two roommates, Close and Villarreal. I observed Close display her copy of the list of items to be searched for on the warrant to Villarreal, point to an item listed on the page and say softly to Villarreal, "They'll get some cookies." I'm aware that the term cookies refers to small information files stored on the user's computer by an internet web browser at the request of software on the website. Now, Craig is out delivering baked goods in his car because the press office doesn't pay any money. We don't actually, we don't make any money off it whatsoever. There's no money for it, although it is full-time work. So the way that we paid our bills was that he started up a small company that made sandwiches, muffins, and cookies. And we were delivering them to various like co-ops and cafeterias of schools and stuff. He would go out and do that early in the morning. So while we were being raided at 6 a.m., he was already out making the deliveries that morning. And so he gets pulled over and raided in a car full of cookies. And Close, if you knew her, was a funny person, and we're trying to deal with the stress of being raided by the FBI. They're all trampling over our stuff in our house. And she says, "They'll get some cookies," pointing to that they're raiding Craig's car at the moment, full of cookies. But all that is just beyond the capacity of this special agent who's sitting there, who comes up with a much more sinister explanation for the term cookies. Now, if you remember, in 2001, did you know what an internet cookie was? Because I didn't.
No.
Right? I could have done research to figure it out. I'm sure it wasn't top secret information, but it wasn't public, it wasn't like super common. I didn't know, personally. So I didn't even know what an internet cookie was, let alone like have concern for them getting internet cookies on the computers they're taking. And in the paragraph that follows afterwards, this same agent, just the next sentence down after making this criminalized version of the obvious definition of what's going on, mentions the term bakery, talks about the bakery being raided after the car is raided. They then proceed to the bakery where we made the cookies. It mentions the word bakery 7 times. It still doesn't quite grasp the concept that these are actually like chocolate chip cookies, right? That are going on. So I just think that's a good thing to point out.
Which one is this?
And I'll also mention that twice they raided us, and that we have files which are not shown here, and both of the reports, the forensic reports from those raids, both listed that they got absolutely no useful information from the raids, including everything they scanned on the computers and everything. So, they did get some cookies though.
Now, this is another document we obtained under FOIA as a result of that lawsuit. Now, the ATF launched an investigation into a so-called how-to manual that was released by ELF. It was titled Setting Fires with Electrical Timers, an Earth Liberation Front Guide. Now, was anyone old enough to remember the Anarchist Cookbook? Basically, that's what this manual was. And the Anarchist Cookbook showed you how to make Molotov cocktails and things of that nature. So the ATF was trying to find a way to criminalize the ELF, people associated with ELF, for putting out or releasing this publication. If you recall from the earlier slide, 60 Minutes pretty much showed everyone in America how to do this. Now the ATF was looking into their activities. But they were actually, they being the ATF, looking on a way or a method by which they could prosecute for Leslie for distribution of information relating to explosives, destructive devices, and weapons of mass destruction. So your tax dollars at work. And here's another report that we got under FOIA. And you might wonder, what are all these letters? These are exemptions under FOIA. B6 is a personal privacy exemption. B7C is another privacy exemption. B7F is an exemption that allows an agency to withhold information if it would endanger the life or safety of any person. Now, this report indicates there was an informant involved. You could see the individual's DMV photo was deleted. And you can see on April 18th of 2002, this unknown person met with Leslie and provided, let's see, we provided the ATF with 4 points of information. You can see the numbers 1 through 4. So basically, we're reaching the conclusion of our presentation. And what we try to show here is that if you're ever targeted by the FBI or any agency, whether it's state or federal, that you shouldn't just curl into a little ball or hide under your bed. You should actually go on the offensive. You should never lose sight, especially with respect to the FBI, of its history. It's not there to enforce laws and to protect you and me. The FBI's sole purpose was, has been, and always will be, is to monitor and quash domestic political dissent. So it's our hope that by showing you that what happened to Leslie, that there are tools available. You should talk to other activists, get together, and fight back. Learn how to use FOIA, cultivate relationships with the media, and expose the criminality of these different agencies. I think we've been pretty successful, and I hope that others can learn, and that the techniques we used in Leslie's case can be used to help other activists. We'll open it up to questions after Leslie closes, but I want to thank you all for coming out on a Sunday at 9 a.m. on a beautiful sunny day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just going to point out a couple things really quickly. I'm going to keep it short because this is a small crowd, so we'll just answer your questions specifically. But one of the things that has come out so far of our lawsuit and our legal FOIA efforts is that the FBI has admitted that they have over 30,000 pages on me. We haven't gotten any FBI files yet. Everything we showed them are TSA, Post Office, ATF, Portland Police, and Oregon State Police files, which we have successfully gotten so far. But FBI is actually, we're prevailing on the case, and they've been ordered by a judge to release these 30,000 pages over the next 3 years in packets every 4 months. They're actually a little behind right now, trying to get the first packet or first two packets out of their hands right now. But
But 30,000 pages is a lot. If you're familiar with other cases that have come out, there's really only a couple that I know that have more than that. Is anyone familiar with Leonard Peltier? Mike, do you know offhand how many pages we eventually got up?
Yeah, Leonard Peltier nationwide has 140,000 plus pages.
So that's the biggest one of activists that I'm aware of. But you know, mostly if an activist gets like 3,000 pages or 1,000 or even 500, that kind of, you know, it's pretty like, wow, I got a big FBI file. So 30,000 pages is among the FBI's largest. They break down their files into 3 categories: small, medium, and large. And 30,000 is very, very easily in the large category. So there's a lot of pages that they're processing for us right now, and we're going to have a lot more of this kind of stuff to talk about in the future. But just think it's important to point out a couple things. Mainly, and again I'm going to keep it brief. Mainly, this stuff is really stressful. It's really hard to deal with it. Not everyone can deal with it. In fact, most people can't deal with it. Just because you have what it takes to write a letter to your representative or to hold a sign in front of a building doesn't mean that you have what it takes to fight these government agents for years and years on end while facing long prison terms and physical threats as well, or worse. So when this stuff happens, you begin to lose sight of what it is that you're really working for and think about, oh my God, I'm going to prison, or oh my God, I'm going to be killed, or my life has totally gone down the tubes, or whatever. It's very stressful and difficult, and so that's how they get you. Right at that point, when you stop prioritizing what it is that you're fighting for, and start thinking about your personal consequences and losses and sacrifices over the bigger issue of what's really going on in the world that you got out here in the first place to fight for and protest for, that's when they win, right? Because then you're afraid you're going to start just reassessing your activities based on what is personally best for you. You didn't go out and hold a sign. You didn't go out and do some protest or some civil disobedience because it was the best thing for you in the first place. In most cases, like that's not really why you're out there. You're out there because it's the best thing to do, for everybody and everyone, all the animals and all the world, the environment, whatever, people in other countries, whatever it is that you're protesting for. The best thing for you is just to kind of run and hide in the short term. That's not really what's the best overall for everybody. And so when you start thinking about, oh, I'm going to go to prison and start shifting gears like that, that's when they win. That's when they stop, because their point is to stop you from doing what you're doing. And their point in my case is to stop me from getting the world to pay attention to what the ELF is doing, and get the world to understand what the ELF is doing, right? And so if I were just like, okay, if I had a lawyer, which I did at various points, it was just like, you should stop doing this press work. We're just gonna like fight this grand jury subpoena quietly and blah blah blah. And most lawyers have that orientation. Thankfully, Mr. Kuzma does not. Because they're just looking out for the short-term interests of their clients. Well, in this case, your client is an activist, and the interests of your clients are to protect the environment, right? And so, does being quiet and not making a big deal out of it help the environment? No. No, it allows these agents to do this kind of thing and much worse over and over again, generation after generation, and makes it so that we don't win, right? And I'd just like to point out real quick that the reason that we often don't win isn't because we don't have enough people, or we don't have enough money, or we don't have any good ideas, or we don't know what else we would do if we weren't for this wonderful system. It's actually because every time we start to figure out ways to make a real impact, they come in and shut us down with force, threats, intimidation, force, harassment. And that's why the FBI exists, and many other agents like Homeland Security and ATF, the ones I'm dealing with. They exist to stop these movements from succeeding. So if they, every time they start seeing the women's suffrage movement or the civil rights movement or whatever, the anti-apartheid movement, whatever is existing, start to gain ground and to make some real progress, they find a way to throw people in prison or to scare people out of being involved. And so the moment they get you to start worrying about whether or not you're going to prison over the fact that the world is being destroyed is the moment that they win. And so that's the only thing that's been able to keep me, not just during the 10 years that I was dealing with the harassment of the ELF press office, but 15 years later, now, still dealing with it. The only thing that's been able to keep me from doing that is to keep in mind like what it is that I'm standing for, you know, and that if we don't fight to protect the world, that it'll be dead. Where it's facing annihilation, and that we need to stand up and fight back, and that these government agencies might have a lot of power, but they have no righteousness. They don't have the rights to do what they're doing. They're not good. They're very bad. You know, and we are going up against something that is very powerful and very destructive and very dangerous, and we have almost no power, relatively. And so what we're doing is righteous. You know, it's not always pretty. It takes a lot of sacrifice, takes a lot of compromise and a lot of hard work, but we're doing it because it's the right thing to do. And you have to go out and you have to stand up for the right thing, no matter how strong your enemy is. You know, and in this case, this is David and Goliath scenario. You know, but in the long run, you know, David didn't win by running and hiding, right? He won by standing up against this impossible enemy and taking a shot at it. You know, and so that's basically what I want to say. So I'm sure there's some questions. I'm hoping there's some questions that we can answer more specifically. So thank you.
Yes.
I just want to thank both of you. I've been at many events with Leslie, but Leslie I've never attended, so I'm glad that I finally got, I've been following your story, and I also want to thank Mr. Kuzma, is how you say your name?
Yes.
I just know, I don't have nearly what Leslie has going on, but I feel so lucky that there are lawyers, like, because I don't understand the law, it frustrates me, it's so easily malleable.
Yes.
And I have, back in the Twin Cities, a vegan anarchist lawyer. Without him, I feel like I would be, I don't know where I'd be right now. I would just feel like my life was fucked, basically, like you were saying. So I really just appreciate so much that you're willing to take on these cases, when it's sometimes easier just to have like the traditional clients and just collect a lot of money and things like that. And what I guess the question I have for you, Leslie, you know, and a lot of the article titles I saw were about, you know, someone with a radical past is being harassed now. There's a part of me that thinks there's no way the FBI, I could be wrong, really thinks that you're engaging in these activities. I don't believe, do they really think this, or are they just harassing you because of your past? So, or they really think that you are a terrorist, or is this scare tactics for people who might take on a role you did?
I think we don't exactly know for sure, but there's a lot that I can say about that. That's what we're trying to figure out.
Okay, yeah.
To an extent, do they really think that I was involved in this? They have. And while the press office was going down, that was their main point over and over again to courts and media, was that these people, Leslie and Craig, who are running the press office, they're actually throwing on ski masks that night, burning down the buildings, and then taking the ski mask off, getting a button-up shirt on, and going in front of the press the next day, which seems absurd to me, but actually there was some precedent. If people are familiar with Rod Coronado's case, and there was actually some precedent for that. And we don't always have enough people to make this delineation, but in our case we did, you know, and that's what we actually took the press office on as like a full-time job with, you know, people working a lot of hours into it, and that's part of the reason why ELF got so much press. I mean, we did 60 Minutes 3 times, Rolling Stone magazine I think 3 times. You know, Dateline, not just in the U.S. but in Australia and Europe. I mean, we did so much press, it was like sickening. And that's, you know, not because of the great work we were doing necessarily. It was because of the ELF was burning down these big buildings, and it was big news, right? But they would always go on these shows and say, you know, that these people, that the press officers for the ELF press office, if they're not responsible, they know who is, and they're just keeping it a secret from us. And that was a big thing for a long time. And if you looked at the ATF files that I had, the vast majority of them were captured under the Romania 2 action, which I talked about earlier, the SUV action at the beginning. They actually thought that I was responsible for that. They ran my fingerprints for that. I got word of that back then. And the majority of the file from the ATF focuses on that investigation, because they actually thought that I had went down to Eugene and burned those cars myself. And so now the case is solved, and other people are serving prison for it. But nonetheless, that was their thought at the time. So there are a lot of other actions that are unsolved. while if a tree falls, you see that, you know, a bunch of these cases did get solved, there's an equal amount, if not more, that are unsolved. And since the Patriot Act passed, you know, for any arson that's politically motivated, there's no statute of limitations, so these investigations can go on indefinitely. So, as was mentioned in that one document, there was a $1 million arson in Allegheny Forest in Pennsylvania that torched a genetic engineering research facility that was part of the U.S. Forest Service. So they were doing breed trees that grow faster. So, you know, of course, they can cross-pollinate with the natural trees in the forest there. Nonetheless, the research station got torched, cost $1 million in damages. It was not far from Buffalo, where is my hometown and where I live. And it was like not long after I moved back to Buffalo. And you know, they think that I have something to do with that, apparently, and that is unsolved. So there is some precedent. I don't want to act like it's ridiculous, although I do think it's ridiculous, especially because I've been under such intense monitoring for, what, almost 20 years? According to this, I mean, when they first listed me associated with the ALF, the Animal Liberation Front, in 1996, 19 years. I've been listed as associated with a terrorist organization. They've raided me twice, actually more than that in different ways, but it's been a long string of surveillance. And for them to think that somehow I'm breaking through their like wall of surveillance and going out and doing these like hugely illegal things seems absurd to me, but nonetheless, they are not as coordinated and they are not as professional as we sometimes think they are. And so it's possible that certain agents think different things. It may just be that there's a directive from a high-up agency within FBI telling the local field offices that this person is a terrorist, watch them, and they interpret that as they will. So it's really hard to say. I think it's annoying that the radical past thing comes up on the thing, because I'm no less radical.
Yeah, I was thinking, like, he's so radical. Yeah.
Nonetheless, I'm not going to let that get in the way of what I'm doing. So the other thing is that I honestly think, and some of these documents show, that they're actually really interested in burning books. And we have a table out there if you're interested. If you're ever going through Buffalo, please check us out. We try really hard to be like not your ordinary radical bookstores, if there is an ordinary radical bookstore, but we try really hard. We bring in a lot of speakers. This month we've had Jake Conroy, who was a Shack 7 defendant, and Claude Marks, who attempted to free Puerto Rican political prisoners in the 80s and was underground for a decade atop the FBI's most wanted list. We just showed 1971 like last Wednesday, which is a new documentary about the people who broke into the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania in 1971 and exposed the FBI's illegal activities under COINTELPRO. We do this stuff constantly. We bring in speakers from around the country, even around the world, speaking about various struggles, not just animal rights or environmental struggles, but about the American Indian movement or the Black Panther Party or anti-apartheid struggles or whatever, like constantly bringing in radicals. And we have a focus on people who've, like, a lot of times who fought the system in a very tangible way. So we don't just bring in people who are talking heads, we bring in people who served prison time for what they've been doing. They've been on like America's Most Wanted, so-and-so, whatever. So we are very active and we are very well connected. I think that that's something they're concerned about. And so I think they're actually very concerned with what's going on with this bookstore. Even though it's just a bookstore, it's fully legal. You know, we file our tax return reports and all that kind of stuff. We're like on the books, totally. You know, at the same time, we're suing the government and we're connected. We got Bill Ayers to come and speak, and Bernadine Dorn from the Weather Underground to come and speak at our books. So Ward Churchill, as Mike mentioned, we're very connected to almost all the radical movements. Progressive radical movements in this country, and we have people come in and speak, and we work hard. So it's possible that they're like, in my mind, I think that they're concerned about, here's this person who's like, who we always wanted to send to prison for ELF stuff, right? Who's like at the forefront more or less of like the radical environmental struggle, and in recent years, this person has been making all kinds of connections with, you know, the radical anti-Vietnam War movement, with the Black liberation struggle, with the Puerto Rican independence struggle, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the American Indian movement, et cetera, et cetera. These are not connections that we want to see happen, right? FBI's point of view is that we want those movements that are essentially in the past to be forgotten about, and we don't want new movements or movements that are still alive to make connections with other struggles that are also against the government, because, you know, intersectionality is dangerous. especially when it's militant intersectionality, right? And so I think it's complicated. I don't exactly know what they're after, but I think that that's part of it. I also think part of it is that our region, the fracking issue in our region, during this time period was, especially was very significant. People didn't know where it was going to go, and here I am. I'm living in the region, and I'm talking about the ELF, and I'm running the bookstore. All these people from all around the region are coming into the bookstore, and they don't want the ELF type action to start happening around the fracking movement, stuff like that. So I think it's a mix of a whole lot of things. And in general, as Mike said, I think that they just don't want people thinking, talking about freedom struggle at all. Just the fact that, forget all of my past, just the fact that there is a Buffalo field agent of the FBI, the field office of the FBI, they get a lot of federal money. If they want to get that money next year, they better figure out something good to do with it. What's going on in your area? Well, there's a bookstore that's bringing in all these people that the FBI sent to prison and over the years, and they're doing it consistently, and they're getting in the news about it, and there's somewhere to go, waste our time. So yeah, I think.
Money is always follow the money trail.
Oh yeah. If you've ever worked for a nonprofit, you know how this justifying budgets works, and that's how they work. They get federal money, and if they want to get that again next year, they better have a terrorism case that they're working on. So I think it's complicated. It's a mix of things, but yeah.
Thank you both so much. I'm in awe. How do you, Leslie, how do you live your internet life and your life online? I mean, surely you must be watched and surveilled there. Are you conscious of that, or maybe you're not? I don't know, but I'm so conscious now when I do any sort of search. We all are. But how do you?
Try to be conscious of that. We don't have any specific information on that from recent years yet. And I expect that we might not get a lot of it now that a lot of the way that happens now is that the FBI and other similar agents are actually subcontracting that stuff out to companies like Stratfor, private companies that do it for them, and that offers them additional protection. And I think that that's the direction that these agencies are going to be going, because a corporation, no one can be held accountable, but a government agency is actually supposed to be very accountable to what it's doing. So there are these private companies now that do this for hire, and because they're corporations, there's protection for the shareholders and the board members and all the people running it, so they can't be held accountable. So we'll see if we ever get that information. So just start off with that. But in general, the internet is not a safe place. It was developed by the military before it became public domain. A lot of great activism in the area of keeping it as free as possible, and I'm supporting all of that. And I think there are a lot of weaknesses in it because they don't have full control over it. But always keep in mind that it was developed by the military, as was Facebook, was developed with the CIA initially. So you don't want to put incriminating information on these things, or
Right, but even doing harmless searches can kind of...
Yeah, and they're gonna, they can profile you. My situation is a little different. I've been heavily profiled since I was 19. Actually 18 according to that one document now. I've been saying 19 before I got that document, now I know it's 18. So I've been a public figure who's been publicly profiled for these things. So my situation is different. In my case, I actually kind of welcome it. We're gonna try to find out about it and expose it as much as possible. So if they want to surveil me, well then I'm going to try to find out about it, and I'm going to make a big deal out of it. So it's a little different for me. If I was somebody who was going out and doing things that the government might think are illegal, I might have a different point of view on it. But because I'm a person who speaks publicly and exercises free speech as my form of activism, then I say in a way I say bring it on, because it gives me more to work with to fight it against. So yeah, that stuff is totally, anything on the internet, telephone, you can't, I think that's just security culture 101, is that you cannot be putting anything on the internet. They're gonna profile you, but the reality is there are a lot of people searching a lot of things on the internet all the time. So in terms of just being oh, this person went and read Animal Liberation, Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, bought it from Amazon or something like that, I'm gonna start an investigation of, they don't have that much resource, because there are so many people who buy like a vegan cookbook online, and they're not gonna like start monitoring all these people all the time. And in a way, they would like to, and they're doing this sort of data mining all the time now with the mention in here of how they're scanning all the letters. So every letter sent, so every letter you sent to PETA or whatever group that you're working with, you know, they have that on file. Does that mean someone's looking at it? No. What it means at this point is that if your flag is raised around you at some point, and they want to see if they think maybe, oh, you were in this town near this place, maybe you had something to do with burning down this place that night, then they might say, well, show us what this person had sent in the mail 6 months or 6 years ago, and you know, oh, look, there's 3 letters to PETA. Maybe this person has a motive. So that's what exists now, but it's changing constantly, and they're gonna, you know, it's gonna get worse. It's only getting worse. It's not gonna get better. One of the things, we had Josh Harper, who was a Shack 7, Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, Shack 7 former prisoner and defendant, at the bookstore, and the whole point of his talk was that we need to take action now because it's only getting more and more difficult and more impossible as the surveillance state becomes so wide, you're never going to be able to get away with anything. Which I think is a pretty valid point. So I think that, yeah, in general, like I'm cautious, you know, I don't use Facebook for social stuff. Like I don't tend not to put like a lot of photographs of like my family and myself up there, but I put a lot of photographs of like these presentations up. I use it for this type of stuff, and I don't, you know, hand over personal information out of the ordinary. But I mean, if you Google search me, there'll be an awful lot on there because I've done a lot of actions. So it's a mix. You know, you can't if you don't want to use. For a while, I didn't want to use Facebook, and I realized that there's a whole generation of young people that I'm just not even reaching because that they don't even have email accounts. They just have Facebook accounts. So yeah, you got to think about what it is that you do, and then think about your security alongside of that. You know, and my situation is not like everybody else's, so I do it a certain way, but I think that everyone should think about those things.
Yeah, so thank you both for such a wonderful presentation. Actually, one of my favorite presentations of the entire conference, so thank you so much.
Awesome.
Also, thank you for your books. I lived in Buffalo for a year.
Oh yeah?
Myself, yeah.
Excellent.
My question is, so I don't know much about the recent history of the ELF, like from the last 10, 12 years or so. I was wondering if you could comment on that. It seems to me, and this could be totally wrong, that ELF actions have declined. And if you were to offer any conjectures or reasons why you think that might be the case. So that's question one. And the second question I had was, so I've been thinking now about FOIA, and I know that you're presenting on it soon, but I have to leave to catch a bus. My question is it suspicious with the FBI to file a FOIA request just out of curiosity to see if they have anything on me, or is that
Why don't we start with that?
Yeah.
Well, they allegedly, the FBI that is, start files, like say they don't have a file. They allegedly start one on you. That's what I've been told, but I've never seen any evidence of that, and I wouldn't let that inhibit.
So just by filing there.
Yeah, supposedly, but I don't let that inhibit you. If you think you've done something where you've drawn the attention to the FBI or some other agency, make the request. I've been doing this since the late 70s. And I think just to, again, hide under your bed or inhibit yourself from doing it just because they might create a file because they don't have one would be foolhardy.
Okay. Yeah.
But I've seen no evidence of it.
I'm a
Don't-
permanent resident, so
What's that?
I'm a permanent resident, so I'm not.
You don't have to be a
citizen.
U.S. citizen to use FOIA. Privacy Act's a little bit different.
Okay.
But I have some, I know I'm showing my age, but I have some FOIA handouts if you have to cut out.
Oh, yeah, I love one, yeah.
Yeah, so I'll catch you before you.
Nice one.
Yeah. On that note, I think also, you know, the more people that are filing for a request, the better. There was a recent document that came out within the last like 3 or 4 years that specifically said that the FBI was investigating the anarchist movement. They were specifically saying that they were expressing a lot of concern that people in the movement were using FOIA. that they're taking advantage of the Freedom of Information Law to expose what the FBI is doing. There's an activist, Ryan Shapiro, who's been working hard to sort of show what the FBI has done over the last 20 or so years around the animal liberation movement. And the FBI is denying all of his requests because they're huge requests. I'm one of the people that he's trying to find out about. But they're not giving him anything, and the reason is that it's the mosaic argument, they say. So if you were to look at all these requests together, all these people, all their files, all the files on all the organizations, and if you looked at everything in the big picture, you could start to get a sense that would expose their investigative techniques and would sort of expose everything that they're doing, which is exactly what Ryan's trying to do, right? But they're saying that that's not legal, they don't, and that's the reason why they can deny the request. So I just think that, yeah, you know, we're not in this because we're afraid and we just are trying to be quiet. You don't become an activist to be quiet, you become an activist to make noise. And the more people that make noise, the more noise there is, and the harder it is to distinguish what's going on. So the more people that are filing FOIA requests, like maybe the FBI will start a file on me, but then they got a whole lot of files on a whole lot of people that they don't really have the resources to follow up on, and just because of big mess, which is good. So I think that was good. And your other comment was about ELF decline.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and potential reasons,
Right.
one often of why that might be.
So I don't know if people have seen If a Tree Falls. It's a documentary. If you haven't seen it, I suggest it. I am featured in it. It talks about one of the big reasons for the decline in there. And declines tend to have happened in all of our movements, even successful movements decline and not successful ones decline as well. And that doesn't mean it's over. There's decline and then it comes back up and down and up and down. But nonetheless, If a Tree Falls, it talks about the cell that they were focusing on was actually responsible for a good amount of the high profile actions. And so when that cell had internal problems, which is mentioned in the film, they had debates over whether they should get even more radical, and people had disagreements about that, and then they had other personal disagreements that ended up sort of dissolving and unfolding the whole structure that they had built. And you know, it's not easy to run a clandestine like guerrilla operation for year after year after year. These things, you don't have money, you don't have resources, you don't have support. In fact, you have all the opposite, right? All the problems. Those are all big problems. And so, you know, eventually they're people just like everybody else, and you know, they might have disagreements and they might have issues that might not. I mean, how long have we stuck to one particular campaign or one particular thing that we're doing? Like, it's very hard. So these things happen. In that case, they had a disagreement, a number of disagreements. Some of them about personal stuff, and some of them about tactics that caused the group to sort of disband. And when that group disbanded, what we saw was an immediate, and this was around early 2001. So it was like maybe 6 months before 9/11. And what we saw then was like an immediate decline, but it wasn't recognizable right away because nobody knew what was going on. It was all in the underground. And so at that point, where 4 months, 5 months passed, like that's normal. You could get a communique any day. It could take 4 months, 5 months before there's another action. So you didn't really even realize that the group had sort of that particular cell that was so active had disbanded. Nobody knew. Then 9/11 happened, and there's this, if you remember, everyone had flags on their front porches, and all the plastic bags that were produced in this country all had God Bless America all over them. And, it was like a totally different environment immediately. And I think that, you can't discredit the power of that to deter people from not just burning down buildings, but from going out and holding a sign, right? I mean, it was pretty pervasive, and I think that we're still recovering from that as a society. I think it's going to take a lot longer for us to get over that, especially because they keep hyping up all this terrorism nonsense over and over again, and it just keeps us afraid. And when you're afraid, you don't fight back, right? And so what the ELF is doing is fighting back. So anyway, it's complicated, but it's not that black and white. There were several actions that happened in the following years. ELF was still, I would say, relatively very active through 2004-ish, 2003, 2004-ish. There was a $50 million arson at a housing complex in San Diego that was built to house genetic engineering researchers. That was the biggest ELF action, ever. that happened down there in San Diego, and there was like a little spree of things that happened down there. An SUV lot was torched at the same time. Those are all unsolved. So that was happening in 2003, which is, you know, post 9/11, obviously. And then in 2008, there was a really big $8 million action in outside of Seattle that torched this place called the Street of Dreams. Street of Dreams is like a luxury home development. It's really complicated. It's like a home. They do a home show. They buy a piece of pristine land, and they do this all around the country, and it goes on TV. And then they buy a piece of pristine land. In this case, it was on a watershed in Snohomish County, Washington. And they divide some plots out of it. Houses in like a natural area within so much space. In order to do that, they leave a lot of it natural, and they cluster the houses together in areas that everyone feels like they're out in the wilderness, and they raise the property values, right? And so they built this thing on there, and they divide the 6 or 8 parcels up between the biggest developers in the area. And the developers then each build their fanciest, showiest house that they can build. Then they invite literally hundreds of thousands of people out to check out the houses. Those people aren't coming to buy those specific houses, they're coming to start negotiations with each of those developers. They go through and tour each house, and then they talk to the developers, and developers are each trying to get them to say, oh, I'll build your custom luxury home for you. And they're like, oh, I like this waterfall, but the place across the street, I like their 5-car garage, or, you know, I like this bathroom that you have, but I want this one. And then, you know, work out the contract with those developers. So, so they did this thing in Snohomish County, and it was built on a watershed. It was like all protested for years before it went down by locals, and they went ahead with it anyway. And so ELF went in and they burned down the buildings, like, you know, they're empty houses, that show houses, and they burnt them down, 8 million in damage. That was 2008. That was the last major ELF action in the U.S. And, you know, there's, like I said, there's several unsolved actions, but we haven't seen the type of frequency that we certainly haven't seen the kind of frequency we saw in the late 90s, early 2000s since then. And, you know, you can only speculate as to why. But I think it's just a matter of time before, you know, right now all movements seem to be at a low point. Maybe they're starting to rebound a little bit here, but I think all movements. I mean, you're not seeing, and people here are very familiar with the animal liberation movement, you're not seeing the kind of activity today with the animal liberation movement that you saw during, you know, 2000, 1999, 2002, whatever. Like, you just, that's not what's going on right now. And I think that you could say that pretty much across the board for almost every movement. And a lot of that has to do with exactly what we're talking about here: surveillance, repression, quelling of political dissent, spreading fear, you know, labeling everything under the sun as terrorism, and you know, and making it seem like you're a bad guy or a bad person because you know, because you want to make the world a better place, right? So that's the sort of political climate that exists in the country, which it is and has been for 15 years now. It's hard. It makes it a whole lot harder to get a movement going. Whereas the opposite end of the spectrum, like when COINTELPRO was exposed and the Pentagon Papers were released and Watergate happened in the 70s, the political atmosphere in the U.S. was so favorable towards radicals and so critical of the government that almost all of the Weather Underground, all these people who were like the top left fugitives across the United States, almost all of them came up for Underground, like turned themselves in and got almost no prison sentences whatsoever. And they negotiated these deals with their lawyers because the political climate in the country was such that like people were willing to like forgive political radicals because, hey, look at all this horrible stuff the government's doing. But now it's different. You know, we need to get to the point, post-Watergate point again now, and expose what these governments are doing and have been doing to all of us for a long time in order for us, our movements to like start gaining ground again. Because right now it's just, I mean, it's draconian, you know, what's going on. So I think we might be, we're out of time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Check out the FOIA panel, room 140.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you.
If you go to there's a FOIA section on the Burning Post
So,
website.
I'm gonna run.
Yeah, I just can't help but be curious. I just
So
want to
just
know.
know, just dawned on me, after
Yeah,
the
that's
snow revelations, or all the agencies had an uptick in FOIA requests.
Yeah.
And they definitely, if you're considered a prolific FOIA requester, they definitely get a file. So somebody like me.
Right.
But if you just make a random, yeah, so if you just make a random request, you apply.
Yeah.
And they do keep logs, like if you just type in FOIA logs, you'll see everything you can see. And they have to for Congress, okay, so you're gonna show up as something.
Okay, great.
But it's only when you have multiple requests that they want. Well, with me, I'm sort of in the same boat as Leslie. My file's 2,500 pages. I was involved in Lemon Peltier's case and what have you. So my situation's a little bit different. But if you were heavily involved in, say, Occupy or